Hey guys, it's Madison Estes. Welcome back to my channel. I have a very ambitious video today. I'm going to be rating every single horror/thriller movie or show that I saw that came out this year. The first movie I'm going to be talking about is No Exit, that came out on Hulu in January. This movie is about a recovering drug addict that gets stranded at a rest stop during a blizzard. She realizes that there is a girl that is inside one of the vehicles who's been kidnapped, and she has to go into the rest stop and figure out who it is out of the 5 strangers is the one that has the girl kidnapped in their car. This was a really good locked room mystery. It had a lot of tension, a lot of twists and turns, and it was very action-packed in the last act of the film. Overall, I give this 5 out of 5 stars. The next movie I saw also came out in January, and that was Scream, also known as Scream 5, but for some reason they decided to call it Scream. I really did not enjoy this film. I just thought that it was a little bit overhyped, and I'm usually a really big fan of the Scream films. This one just didn't do it for me. The characters all felt very flat and very much the same. I did enjoy the one scene where they talked about legacy characters and remakes and requels. I thought that was really interesting. But honestly, for the most part, I just really didn't find this film satisfying at all. I thought that the twist of who did it was kind of lame. I was like, who are they again? And then the motive, of course, was also very derivative. And I don't know, I was just really disappointed. I'm also not really looking forward to the next one because Neve Campbell's not going to be in it. And also because I'm like, well, who from the original series is left? Like, at this point, it just feels, I don't know, like a copycat. Just kind of funny because the killers are always copycats, but I just mean like the film itself feels, you know, like it's a ripoff of the original movie. So I understand this is a film that a lot of people liked. It just didn't do it for me. I give it 2 out of 5 stars. The next movie I saw in February was Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Now, if you know anything about the series, you know that the continuity is terrible. It has had so many direct sequels to the first one, and then it's had some where it's like, oh, this is a prequel to this remake, and this is actually the prequel to this, and it's messy. It's really messy, and some of them don't even feel like they connect to any of the movies. So, you know, the series as a whole is a mess, but some of the individual installments I feel are pretty good. I really like the original remake and The Beginnings, which was the prequel to that one. And then everything else is just kind of hit or miss, you know, the violence is fun in some of them, and that's kind of how I felt about this new one. It had some cool deaths, it had some really fun scenes, like Leatherface sawing his way onto a bus, and there was another scene shortly after that where somebody stabs Leatherface with a little keychain chainsaw. It's just a fun film with, you know, some really bloody scenes, and I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. The next movie that I saw is X by Ty West. I really enjoyed this film a lot. It's about a group of filmmakers that go to rural Texas to film a porno called The Farmer's Daughters, and the elderly couple that live there find out what they're doing and deadly consequences arise. This movie had some really cool deaths in it. The cinematography was fantastic, the dialogue was interesting, and while the plot wasn't anything spectacular, I did think that it felt very original. I give this film 3.5 out of 5 stars. The next film I saw was Uma, and honestly, the less I say about this film, the better. I just was not impressed by this at all. It's about a woman who's dealing with grief after her mother dies, and it's just a ghost story without really any original elements to it, and it's just not a great story. And what's worse than that is that the music is so distracting. It's very loud, and, you know, it just kind of takes over some of the scenes. And it's like every 5 minutes this happens, and you just kind of feel like someone's tapping you on the shoulder, reminding you, oh, by the way, you're watching a horror movie. It was really distracting, and I just couldn't get into this movie at all. 1 out of 5 stars. The next film I watched that I believe qualifies as a thriller is The Batman. This was one of my favorite films of the year, honestly. I thought that it was very cool. It definitely reminded me of Seven and Saw, particularly whenever they found the Riddler's lair, or whatever you want to call it, his hideout, his house, with all the journals and notebooks. It was very reminiscent of Seven, and I just thought it had some really cool twists in it, you know, some things that kept me on my toes, and, you know, I loved the gritty noir feel to it. Somehow this Batman movie felt more like a Saw film than the last 2 Saw films. It was very cool. I enjoyed it a lot. I really hope that they do a sequel to this. Maybe they'll get Jigsaw involved. I don't know, but I enjoyed it a lot, and I give it 5 out of 5 stars. The next film I saw that was kind of a thriller, kind of a superhero movie, but 100% a disappointment was Morbius. Now, a lot of people said Morbius was terrible. I don't think it was terrible, I just think that it was completely mediocre in every single way, and because there was so much hype surrounding it, I mean, this movie had been pushed back for 2-3 years now, Everybody was just expecting something really great, and honestly, this film just didn't deliver. For those of you that don't know, this movie is about a man who is sick, and he's also a brilliant scientist. He tries to find a cure for his illness, and he ends up turning himself into a vampire. Now, that is a very interesting premise. I just don't feel like they did anything interesting with the storyline, and also the special effects weren't great. I give Morbius 2 out of 5 stars. The next movie I saw sometime in April on Hulu was Fresh. This movie is about a girl that's kind of down on her luck when it comes to romance and love, so she tries online dating, and here's a life tip: don't try online dating. And she ends up meeting a guy that has some ulterior motives for wanting to date her. This movie had a lot of fun scenes in it. There's a lot of dark, dry humor in it as well. My only complaint is that, the last act felt a little bit in comparison to everything that came before. I wouldn't say it was disappointing. It was just slightly underwhelming in comparison to everything else that had been building up to that moment. But I still enjoyed this movie a lot, and I definitely think it deserves a watch. I give it 3 out of 5 stars. The next movie I'm about to talk about is a Netflix film that received a very underwhelming response. I think the title is a big reason why people didn't like this film and give it a chance. I thought that it was a lot of fun. It's called Choose or Die. So the movie description says, after firing up a lost 1980s horror survival game, a young coder unleashes a deadly curse which forces her to make terrifying decisions and face deadly consequences. This movie reminds me a lot of Beyond the Gates, which I also enjoyed, and a little bit of Jumanji and Saw. In fact, I think if Jumanji and Saw had a baby, it would be this film. Some of her loved ones are put in horrifying situations, and she's given 2 options, both of which are awful, that she has to decide between to help save the person she cares about. And all of these situations are described in such a way that it sounds like she's having to make a decision for a character. So it's really interesting. I thought the premise was really cool. I thought the deaths were pretty cool. Honestly, I thought this was an underrated film. So like I said, I think that, there's maybe a few moments of this film that are a little bit cheesy, but ultimately I thought it was really cool, and I think that if it had had a different title, people might have responded to this film differently, which is really unfortunate, but I hope that you'll give it a chance. I gave this film 3.5 out of 5 stars. The next movie I'm about to talk about got a ton of hate when it came out, but I specifically made a video on it because I liked it and I wanted people to know it's not as bad as everyone thinks it is. That film is the new Firestarter. This movie is about a girl named Charlie who has pyrokinetic abilities. Her parents also have superpowers. They were all experimented on, and that's how they gain these powers. And they are being hunted by an agency that wants to do experiments on them and most likely terminate them when they're done. This film is similar to the original in a lot of ways. The plot is very similar, and a lot of the characters are similar as well. One interesting difference is that the character Rainburn is cast by an indigenous actor, which is appropriate because the character is supposed to be Cherokee. One big difference is that obviously the new film has better special effects, and I also think that the acting is better as well, especially the actress that plays Charlie. This is a very solid remake in my opinion. I originally gave this film 4 out of 5 stars in my Firestarter movie review. I still think that it deserves 4 out of 5 stars, despite the fact that it did not make my top 5 films of the year. I think the reason is that I've seen this storyline before, not just with the original Firestarter, but also the Dark Phoenix storyline, and just there's been different versions of this story for a while. So it's not a particularly fresh story like it was when the original Firestarter came out, which I think is also a big difference between the reception today versus when the original came out. So for me, I enjoyed it. I thought that the film did everything that it was setting out to do. It wasn't quite as original as the ones I picked for my top 5. So if you're wondering why did I give this 4 stars and not rank it above some of these other films, that would be why. The next thing I want to talk about is a show, and that is Stranger Things. So I saw the first season a couple years ago, and then I told myself I was going to get back into it, and I just kept putting it off. Anyways, I had heard, or thought that I had heard, that this was going to be the last season, so I was like, oh yeah, I'm going to go ahead and binge the whole series. Of course, it turns out there's going to be another season coming, which I'm actually really excited about because I really love this show. I kind of wish there was even more seasons coming, although I do understand why they want to wrap it up. All of this to say that season 4, which came out this year, I give it 4 out of 5 stars. I give the first 3 seasons 5 out of 5 stars. I think all of them are fantastic in different ways. I think the first 2 have a really good balance of feeling, mystical and magical like a Steven Spielberg film, but also at times feeling, like very much like a horror film. And the third one, was fun. It felt like a blockbuster movie, which is exactly what they were going for based on interviews I've heard. I felt like those were like 3 perfect seasons almost. This 4th season was really good. It was really good. It's just, the freaking California storyline. I'm sorry, the storyline with Jonathan and Mike and Will and the new guy who's like a stoner. I didn't care for that at all. I felt like all of those scenes were very weak, and the stoner character is very one note and gets old very fast. I also didn't particularly like what they did with Robin this season. For whatever reason, they made her a little bit more of a neurotic character than she was the season before. And yeah, I don't know. But then again, Eddie Munson. Eddie Munson is like the best thing to ever happen to this show. I wish he'd been introduced much sooner. I definitely don't think that the Duffer Brothers or anyone, on the show anticipated him becoming such a fan favorite. Even with my complaints about season 4, it's still one of the best shows on TV right now. So really looking forward to season 5, and I'll definitely be talking about that at some point on this channel. Next up is The Black Phone by Scott Derrickson. I loved this movie so much. I did a whole review on it, 5 out of 5 stars, just so you know. It was great. It's about a boy that gets kidnapped by a child molester / murderer called the Grabber, and in the basement that he's being held in, there is a black phone that rings that only he can hear, and he hears the voices of the Grabber's previous victims trying to help him escape. It's a very interesting premise. It's adapted from a Joe Hill short story, which I also really enjoy, and it's just executed really well. There's a lot of tension in this, a lot of really creepy scenes, great atmosphere, and it's just a really memorable horror film that I highly recommend. The next film I want to talk about is Prey, which came out on Hulu this summer. It is the next installment in the Predator series, and it brought some new things to the series. For one thing, this film takes place in the distant past. It is a prequel to all the other films in this series. And another thing is that it revolves around a Comanche warrior who is trying to protect her home from colonizers and apparently from aliens. Also, there is a dog in this film. I just felt like that was worth mentioning. Now, the Cherokee woman, on the other hand, Naru, that's her name, right? Yeah, she's okay. Sorry, she's just not super memorable to me. She's Cherokee, so that's different, but I just felt like they thought that that was enough character development, the fact that she was a woman that wanted to be a warrior. And then, I thought it was interesting when one of the characters asked why. She said, because they told me I couldn't. I'm like, okay, so she's petulant. Like, that's her personality. Someone tells her she can't do something and she immediately wants to do it. It's relatable, but it's not like an entire personality. Like, she doesn't really seem to have any altruistic reasons for doing what she does. She just wants to prove herself, I guess. Although, to be fair, none of the films in this series have particularly developed characters, so that wasn't really something I went into wanting or expecting. I just was a little bit underwhelmed by the character after everybody tried to compare her to Ripley. I guess because she's also a strong woman that had to deal with some annoying aliens, but like, Naru is not Ripley. I don't know. Maybe in the sequel, they are talking about possibly doing a sequel with the same characters, so maybe she'll become Ripley, I don't know. But I do think that it's a very solid installment in the Predator series. I think that it's good that they did things that were new, and I think that they brought a really interesting spin to this. A Yautja that is walking around with like a skull on his head instead of, the usual gear that they wear was really cool. One last thing, I do want to say this film also had excellent cinematography, and it did a really cool foreshadowing thing that I don't want to give spoilers for, so I won't talk about what it is, but if you saw it, you probably know what I'm talking about because it happens near the climax of the movie. I thought that was really cool and not something that you see in a lot of action horror films like this. It has a lot of strengths to it. I hope I'm not being too hard on it just because everybody keeps saying how wonderful it is, and I have to be the one that argues, of course. But it is a really good film. I give it 3.5 out of 5 stars. The next film I want to talk about is Orphan First Kill, which is a prequel to the movie Orphan. In this movie, Esther finds a family that has a missing daughter, and she pretends to be her in order to take over this girl's identity. This is a movie that is really hard to talk about without spoiling the original, so I'm not going to go into any details. I just want to say that I called the twist about 10 minutes or less into this film. I think it might have been more around the 5-minute mark. And people were going on and on about how crazy the twist is. You'll never guess the twist. I guessed it. Which doesn't, diminish all my enjoyment in the film, but it can be kind of disappointing when you watch a film because everyone says the twist is amazing and then you call it like really early. It was still good though. I enjoyed it. I thought they executed the twist really well, and I also thought that it was just a fun film. There was a lot of tension, even though I knew what the twist was before and after they revealed it. I felt like there was a lot of tension. I did kind of feel like the last act could have been a little bit better, a little bit more climatic. Just in terms of, characters revealing secrets on each other. I felt like there could have been a little bit more drama. But overall, I thought that it was a really good film, and I give it 4 out of 5 stars. The next film I want to talk about is a thriller called Lou that came out on Netflix this year, starring Allison Janney. So in this story, Lou, played by Allison Janney, is an ex-CIA field agent who is quietly retired. She's living a loner life kind of in the middle of nowhere, and her next door neighbor and her little daughter are, they're kind of frenemies, sort of. The mom seems to think Lou is cantankerous and mean, and she's kind of right. And, the daughter is a young child who kind of sees the world through rose-colored glasses, and she thinks Lou is their friend. So it's a really interesting dynamic already. And then the little girl gets kidnapped by her deranged father, emphasis on deranged, and you find out why the girl and her mother were, living in seclusion along with the ex-CIA agent. Apparently that's just the place that you go when you want to disappear. So the CIA agent Lou teams up with the mom to try to track down the daughter before the father can get her off the island. It's a really good suspenseful film. I thought there were some really gory deaths in this, and I also thought there were some interesting plot twists along the way. I enjoyed it a lot, and I give it 4 out of 5 stars. The next film I want to talk about is Barbarian. Love it or hate it, it is definitely one of the most talked about films of the year. I don't want to go into any details with the plot because this is one of those films where the less you know, the better. It starts off with a woman who ends up at an Airbnb that has been double booked, or has it. Just kind of spirals from there whenever she, discovers a secret about the house. And I just don't want to say anything else other than the fact that you should brace yourself for when Justin Long comes into the movie. There is a tone shift where it becomes comical for a while, and then it gets a little bit serious again, and then there's kind of some tone shifts throughout. But I enjoyed it a lot. It's a very weird film. You never know exactly where it's going to go next, and that's what makes it so exciting in my opinion. I give this film 4.5 out of 5 stars. The next film I want to talk about briefly, very briefly, is Smile. I think truthfully it's maybe one of the most overhyped. I don't know if it's the worst. There's probably some that came out that were worse. I just didn't bother seeing them because I could tell based on the trailer that they were going to be terrible. But it was one of the worst that I saw. It just was overhyped, honestly. It's very much the same story we've seen in The Ring. A little bit of It Follows, although I think It Follows at least was original in terms of what they did with the ending. This one, they didn't do anything original with the ending. There was one thing they did that was interesting. They created like a curse loophole, but then they didn't do anything with it. Very frustrating. In addition to the fact that people were talking about how great it is, it's so original and all this other stuff, and it's like, it's not. It's your regular horror curse movie. So 2 out of 5 stars. Yeah. Next, I want to talk about the TV show Dahmer. I think that Evan Peters deserves an Emmy nomination for his performance as Jeffrey Dahmer. He did an amazing job. I think that there was good acting throughout, but I think that he definitely is just a whole nother level. His acting really disturbed me at times, particularly his scenes with the mannequin, and then his one scene where he was completely nude on top of one of his victims. My personal favorite episode of the miniseries is episode 6, Silenced, which is about Tony Hughes, who is the deaf partner that Jeffrey Dahmer had, and just kind of seeing, the way that these two men bonded. It was just a really beautiful and sad, I wouldn't say love story, because Dahmer was so dysfunctional. It's like, was he really capable of love? I don't know. But that episode really makes you feel like he could be, like in another life. And in a weird way, I was kind of rooting for them. Like, even though I knew what was gonna happen, I was like, no, I just want this to be a rom-com where these two guys work past their differences and find love and live happily ever after, which is terrible, I know, but I think that it was shot this way on purpose. Some scenes were shot almost like a rom-com or a romance. I think that was done on purpose for the same reason that it was done in the show You, to make us root for a certain character or for a couple, and then to kind of, pull the curtain back and be like, this is what actually happened, this is, the terrible end to that story. And it was a really sad episode, but, I also felt like it was really powerful in terms of, humanizing Dahmer's victims and kind of making you hate Dahmer despite feeling sorry for him at the same time. I saw the film My Friend Dahmer shortly before I rewatched it before watching this, and that's a very sympathetic portrayal of Jeffrey Dahmer. This felt like it was more honest, like it really showed what a monster he was, and it did that by humanizing his victims, but it still managed to make you feel sorry for him. So I thought it did a really interesting job of doing several different things at once. My only complaint is that I felt like they put way too much emphasis on characters that weren't that interesting, particularly the neighbor character, which was actually a composite of two different people. One of them didn't even live in the building, but she was the one that, was suspicious of Dahmer early on and called the cops on him several times, to no avail, obviously. I don't know. I just didn't feel like she was interesting enough to have an entire episode about. And then on top of that, the last episode seemed to focus on her just as much as Jeffrey Dahmer. I definitely think that it should have focused more on Dahmer and his family and the victims. I just felt like there was a little bit too much emphasis on her. Other than that, I felt like it was really good. I enjoyed it a lot. And yeah, I just thought that it was really successful. I give it 4 out of 5 stars. Next up is the movie Goodnight Mommy. This is a remake. I have never seen the original. I don't know the plot of the original. Having said that, I called the twist in this movie less than 2 minutes into it. That's right, it was that obvious. It is about 2 boys that are sent to go stay with their mother, and their mother's entire face is wrapped. She just had cosmetic surgery, and based on the mother acting very erratically and acting kind of mean, they begin to suspect that that's not actually their mother. I will say this about the film. The acting was pretty decent, and even though I guessed the big twist at the end, there was a second smaller twist, and I did not guess that twist, so I will say that that was done pretty well. It's the thing that happens in the last few minutes of the film. I'm not going to go into any more details, but I did feel like that was at least kind of interesting. So I give this 2 out of 5 stars. The next film I want to talk about is the Netflix film Mr. Harrigan's Phone. This story is about a boy named Craig who befriends an older man, Mr. Harrigan. He reads him books in exchange for money because Mr. Harrigan's eyesight is going bad. The friendship develops over the course of many years, and the two become very close. Mr. Harrigan ends up giving Craig a winning lottery ticket. Coincidence? I think not. And the boy ends up getting about $3,000, of which he uses to buy a cell phone for himself, and he gives one to Mr. Harrigan as well. Mr. Harrigan is very anti-technology. It's a very strong theme of the story, but eventually he comes around and likes it. And, the two continue being friends for a while, and then Mr. Harrigan dies. At the funeral, Craig slips Mr. Harrigan's phone into his coffin, presumably out of some form of delusional grief because he wants to continue communicating with him. I don't know, it's never fully explained. Soon after that, Mr. Harrigan begins communicating with Craig from beyond the grave, although by the time it starts to actually get interesting, where Mr. Harrigan is actually influencing things in Craig's life, the movie just abruptly ends. So I don't really feel like that's a spoiler, it's just me helping you manage your expectations. Like I said in another review, it felt like there was a really good story buried in this movie. Unfortunately, I just felt like it ended way too soon. I give this film 2 out of 5 stars. Next up is the miniseries The Midnight Club by Mike Flanagan, adapted from a book by Christopher Pike. So first of all, I reread the book this year, and the book and the miniseries have very few things in common. Even the stories within the frame story are very different, other than The Tale of Two Danas, which was a very close adaptation, and was honestly probably my favorite part of both the book and the miniseries. Unfortunately, I felt like the frame story in the miniseries was very weak in comparison to the book. The book has a lot of themes of reincarnation, and Alonka and Kevin are kind of like star-crossed lovers that have had very different relationships in different lifetimes. And the little mini stories that they tell at midnight are often reflections of who they are, and sort of reflections of their spiritual journeys. And, that's what makes it so interesting. And in the miniseries, they kind of had that. Like, one guy tells a story about, romance and lost love, and it's because he has a crush on one of the other girls. And I actually like the romance between those two side characters more than the one between Kevin and Alonka, because they spent too much time on an original mini story inside of the frame story where Ilonka is like trying to cure herself. She's trying to find some like magical cure because she's in denial, and I felt like that subplot took over the whole frame story and it just pushed Kevin out of the story. And he was just such an important part of the book, and he really just kind of felt like an afterthought sometimes in this miniseries. So I was disappointed by that. I also was really disappointed by the last scene in the miniseries. It really felt like they were trying to, you know, build up some mystery for the next season, which isn't going to happen. It did not get renewed. It just felt very bait and switch. It tonally felt very different. It felt, I don't know, it kind of felt like I was being cheated as opposed to the characters being cheated, if that makes any sense. I wasn't happy with it, but I did like some of the stories within the story, particularly the Starlight Crystal, which was very different from the book by the same name, which I also read this year. I did like the story though, even though it wasn't the same. And the acting was really solid in this, especially Ruth Codd, who plays Anya. I just found out that this is actually her first acting role, and I would not have guessed it. She was so good in this. I cried a few times during some of her scenes. I do feel like this show is worth watching at least once. I don't think I'll ever watch it again, but I did enjoy it, and I would recommend watching it. I just recommend kind of, you know, monitoring your expectations a little bit. I give The Midnight Club 3 out of 5 stars. The next two films I'm going to talk about are both survivor thriller films that have to do with the fear of heights. Fall is about two best friends that decide to climb a 2,000-foot radio tower because that sounds like a good time, and they end up stuck up there. Even though it's a thriller, to me, it's a very horrifying film. You've got the survival horror elements of trying to ration food, of, you know, not knowing how you're going to escape the situation. It's just so horrifying to me because it's both claustrophobic in that these characters have nowhere to go. They're stuck in one very small place, but it's also acrophobic. So it's just, it plays on two very primal fears, and it's very effective at being a horror film despite being a thriller. Seriously, I was just so uncomfortable watching this movie. And you know, it also has some really good characterization, because what else are you going to do when you have two characters in one spot for most of the movie? It does. It has really good characterization, and there were some parts that really gave me some strong feelings. It's a really good movie. I would definitely check it out. 4 out of 5 stars. The next film I want to talk about is called The Ledge, directed by Howard J. Ford. This film is about a girl who captures the murder of her friend on camera, and she is on the run from the killers. She starts climbing in order to try to escape them. Of course, they have the advantage because there's many of them and they're all after her at the same time. So it's a very tense thriller. But it also feels very claustrophobic because there's many moments where she's trapped and they're not really pursuing her because they know that all they have to do is outweight her. You know, they have resources and she has almost nothing. So it's also a little bit survival horror in that aspect as well. While I don't think that the dialogue and the characterization is all that, I do think that it's a great premise. They go in a very interesting direction with it, and it's definitely worth checking out. I give it 4 out of 5 stars. The next movie I'm about to talk about, if you hated this film, you hated this film. I've gotten 3 messages since I released my video on the top 5 best and worst horror films of the year from people asking me, why didn't you put Halloween Ends on your worst list? And let me tell you, now that I think about it, I probably should have. I think I was way too generous with my initial rating. I don't remember what it was, but it was way too high, honestly. This film could have been a decent horror film if it wasn't a Halloween film. If it was just about, you know, the spin-off Corey or whatever, it didn't have the Halloween franchise behind it, it could have been a decent film. But unfortunately, this is a Michael Myers film that barely features Michael Myers. And not only is it a Michael Myers film, but it's also the last film in a trilogy that so far had been very well received. I get what they were trying to do. I get the explanation of, oh, the evil transfers, the evil goes and, you know, somebody else. Like, I don't care. I don't care what they were trying to do because Michael Myers was living in a sewer for years, eating rats and possibly homeless people, I'm presuming, to survive. Michael Myers is not a character that would just hide in a sewer for years, okay? He's not Pennywise, all right? He is an unstoppable killing machine that kills indiscriminately and will murder anyone in his path. He's not gonna hide out in a sewer and just murder homeless people and rats, okay? It's like they don't even understand the character at all. And it's just really frustrating. They did such a good job with the first two films in this series, and they just really dropped the ball with this one. I did really like the character Corey, and I liked his storyline. It just didn't feel like the right movie for it. This is Michael Myers, this is his trilogy, and he was sidelined in his own movie. The only thing that I did truly like is the opening scene. That was a shocker, honestly, especially having heard so many bad things about the movie going into it. I wasn't expecting to like anything about this, and I really liked that opening scene. It kind of gave me some Hereditary vibes in terms of something horrific happening that most people probably wouldn't have anticipated. It was really good. And, my mind started spinning in all these directions of, what are they going to do with this? Is he going to end up in a mental institution? Is that how we're going to meet Michael Myers? And that could have been really interesting if, Corey had met Michael Myers in a mental institution and they had bonded somehow, and then Michael Myers escaped and came back and released Corey or something. I don't know. It's kind of hard for me to imagine Michael Myers having friends. It also kind of is counterintuitive to the character. But I feel like that would have been better even, in terms of like bringing Corey into the story, as opposed to just doing the time jump, which feels really unnecessary. I still have no idea why they decided to do that. That's really, I think, where most of the problems came in and why Michael Myers got sidelined. But anyways, all of this to say, most of the film was kind of a clusterfuck. I give it 1.5 out of 5 stars. The next film I'm about to talk about also got some pretty bad reviews, but in this case I felt like they were unearned. This film is Don't Worry Darling. This movie is about a bunch of suburban housewives living in an isolated community where their husbands go to work, do something very mysterious that they're not allowed to know about, and then come home and they live in this very idealistic world where, the biggest thing they have to worry about is what they're going to bring to the brunch on Sunday. God, if only that was my biggest problem. But of course that begins to raise questions like, what is the project these men are working on? What are the secrets that they're keeping from their wives? And it's a very interesting conspiracy movie that has a twist that I don't think most people saw coming. Also, I just want to take a minute to say this film is absolutely gorgeous. There is some very stunning cinematography in this. The really colorful palette and the way it captures the 50s, 60s era and the way it contrasts that with something else in the film I can't talk about is really brilliant, and it's just a very gorgeous film. Lastly, I just want to say I love the plot. I love the plot twists in this. I love the theme of this film. It's unfortunate that there were some things that went on behind the scenes that caused some controversy with this film. Aside from that petty BS, I thought that this was a good film, and it's unfortunate that some bad publicity has led to some criticism because I thought that this was a very solid film. I give Don't Worry Darling 4 out of 5 stars. Next up is one of my favorite horror films of the year, Significant Other on Paramount+. This movie is about a guy and his girlfriend that go camping in the woods. He proposes to her and she turns him down, and then they have a very awkward confrontation after that. And then things sort of start to spiral from there. But of course, this isn't your average horror movie. It's not like he just goes crazy and hunts her down or anything like that. Something supernatural happens, and I will leave it at that, and I will tell you to just go watch this film with an open mind and prepare yourself for some strange twists and turns, and you might like it, hopefully. And in my opinion, this movie is truly about empathy, and how if you can't empathize with your partner and put yourself in their position and understand how they're feeling, you can't have a real relationship with them. So go check out Significant Other. I give it 5 out of 5 stars. Next up is season 11, the last season of The Walking Dead. This season was really split into 3 parts. The first third of this season was basically Daryl, Maggie, and Negan versus the Reapers. This group that took over a place that Maggie used to live at and stole all their supplies. They're trying to get all the supplies from them, and the 2 groups are at war. It was kind of meh, honestly. I was not super interested in this. The only thing that really kept me going was the interaction between Maggie and Negan. I thought that was really interesting. That was the main thing that held my focus. Honestly, the first third of this season was pretty subpar. Now the next part of this season was about the characters integrating themselves into the Commonwealth and sort of discovering that there is a conspiracy going on and all the dark, seedy stuff that's going on in the community. So I really enjoyed this part of the season, particularly Hornsby being the main villain. I thought he did such a good job. He's kind of a combination of like the Governor and Milton. Like if they had a love child, it would have been Hornsby. He's got all of Milton's nerdiness and brains, but he's got all of the Governor's craziness and charisma. And sort of like manic American Psycho energy. So I really enjoyed it a lot. And then of course the last act was just kind of, the payoff of everything that the middle of the season was setting up. And then, of course, we also saw Pamela and Sebastian as bigger villains, so that was a lot of fun. My only complaint is that I really wish that Rick and Michonne had come back earlier in the season and we could have seen them fight the Reapers and try to become part of the Commonwealth. I was just kind of disappointed by that. If they're going to come back and do a whole spin-off, why couldn't they be a part of the last season? But overall, I do feel like this was a very strong season. It was a very good final season, although considering all the spin-off shows, is it really a final season? I don't know. Overall, I give the final season of The Walking Dead 4 out of 5 stars. Next up is the horror film Abandoned that was released on Hulu starring Emma Roberts. This is single-handedly the worst horror film that I have seen this year. This movie is about a woman who has postpartum depression. She moves to the country with her husband. They buy a house where someone committed a murder-suicide, but they were like, this is great! This is going to be a great way to start our new life. Because, they're stupid. And of course, she begins seeing ghosts and other supernatural things, and everyone starts gaslighting her, telling her she's crazy, she's crazy. And it's a very unsatisfying film, honestly. Even whenever she does kind of overcome the supernatural beings, you're just like, wait, that's it? 1 out of 5 stars. The next horror film I saw is They Them, starring Kevin Bacon. This movie is about a gay conversion camp and people start getting murdered left and right, and you're kind of wondering, okay, is it one of the people that works there? Is it one of the campers? What is the motivation for the murders? Honestly, this kind of feels like if somebody wanted to make a Friday the 13th film about a gay conversion camp, but then somebody was like, we can't do that, we can't make Jason homophobic, so they were like, okay, let's just take Jason out of it and just make it a random person. And then this film happened. So one of the good things about this film is that because of the premise, there's a lot of gay and lesbian characters. There's also a non-binary character and a trans woman, so there's a lot of good representation in this film. And not only was there good representation, but several of these characters were also developed well enough so that I actually cared about them and whether they lived or died, which I can't say about a lot of horror films. Particularly the main character, Jordan, who is non-binary, was developed the most, and they're kind of a badass, honestly. And I really liked how, the therapist character kind of like gets into their heads, and I know it's horrible to watch her kind of like emotionally abuse some of these characters and like use their vulnerabilities against them, but I also kind of feel like that's what makes it a horror film. That and the murder. I did like it, and it was original, so I definitely recommend checking it out at least once. The next movie I want to talk about is called Margot. This movie is about a bunch of college seniors that decide to celebrate their last days of college in a smart house. And the smart house turns out to have some homicidal tendencies. As she begins killing them one by one, they have to figure out a plan to fight against her, even though she appears to be holding all the cards. They essentially have to outsmart a smart house. So I would definitely recommend watching this one without seeing the trailer. I know that involves a lot of trust in me, and you might not know me that well, but believe me when I tell you the trailer gives away a little bit too much for my liking, and you'll probably like this a lot more if you just go into it blind. If you like the premise, you'll probably like this film. It does have some unexpected twists and turns, which is basically what I ask for whenever I watch any horror film. Just surprise me. Give me some decent characters, some decent dialogue, and surprise me and I'm happy. There's one scene where the character is too stupid or hungover to notice that the house is constantly trying to murder him, and the scene is mostly played for laughs. She tries to poison him, he sticks his hand in the garbage disposal, you think she's about to turn it on. There's just a lot of ways she could murder him, and it's almost kind of like Final Destination, where you're just kind of like looking everywhere waiting to see how he's about to get murdered. It's actually a really funny scene though, the way it plays out. So this movie, even though it's kind of serious sometimes, other times it takes a very comedic turn, and sometimes the characters are just plain over the top obnoxious, but they're meant to be in some cases. I was satisfied by some of the twists. I was satisfied by, the outcome of the story. I felt more than I expected to feel by the end of the film. I'll just say that. Like, I wasn't in tears or anything, nothing like that, but I definitely cared for the characters by the end of the film. So, which is more than I expected from this film. And it was fun, so I give it 3.5 out of 5 stars. The last horror film I saw this year is my favorite horror film of the year, and that is Violent Night. Somehow, this movie manages to be a perfect horror movie and a perfect Christmas movie at the same time. There's incredibly violent murders and very creative deaths in this, but you also have a Santa Claus that cares about children, that, is risking his life to save this little girl on Christmas Eve. And it's just such a heartwarming connection between Santa and this little girl. And then you've got a bunch of murder all around them. So it's a lot of fun. And of course, David Harbour playing Santa, who, you know, drinks whiskey while he's eating his cookies, is just a great character. This is definitely a Christmas movie, or a Christmas horror movie, that I know I'm going to be rewatching regularly. I give it 5 out of 5 stars. I know there's still a lot of horror and thriller movies that I haven't seen yet. I still need to see Pearl, The Invitation, The Menu, Men, and several other films. So if there's one that you feel like I absolutely need to see, please leave a comment in the comment section below. I really love these end of the year lists because it lets me know, you know, what I missed, what I really need to catch up on. So please let me know what you think I should watch. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and be sure to subscribe. On this channel, I post reviews, writing advice, horror commentary, and vlogs. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you later.